While upheaval may seem like a familiar state of affairs to observers of the Middle East, what has taken place in the last decade and a half is of a different order. That, according to journalist Scott Anderson. In his 2016 article, which for the first time ever in its history took up the entire issue of the New York Times Magazine, he called it a profound unraveling. The stories he told there are now a book. It's called Fractured Lands: How the Arab World Came Apart, and we're pleased that it brings Scott Anderson to our studio tonight. Delighted to meet you.
Likewise, Steve.
And thank you for doing this book. The book consists of basically 6 individual portraits of Arab men and women as a way of showing what happened in the Arab countries since the invasion of Iraq. And I want to start with a conversation that you had with a driver that you hired in Jordan. His name was Hassan, and he presented himself as a very strong supporter of King Abdullah. And then he had this to say: "I'm not at all proud to say this, but if I ever was forced to choose between the king and the family, then of course I would choose my family. In fact, it isn't even a matter of choice." What'd you make of that statement when you heard it?
It was fascinating. For me, that conversation, it was kind of an epiphany. I'd spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I knew that tribalism, and when he refers to family, he's referring to his tribe. I always knew that tribalism was an important issue. But in Jordan, Jordan's the most westernized, the most progressive of the Arab states. And for a man, and Hassan was very well educated and forward-thinking and progressive. And for a person like that to talk about how the pull of tribalism was still paramount, I instantly thought, well, if that's true in Jordan, what about in Iraq? What about in Saudi Arabia? What about in Sudan?
So in some respects, that conversation tells you everything you need to know about why the Middle East is in such a mess.
It kind of does. It kind of does.
We hear much about, of course, the conflicts between Sunni and Shia Muslims, but you write that to understand Arab cultures, you need to look underneath to understand the complex, here's your line, the complex tapestries of tribes and sub-tribes and clans. And I guess we in the West need to understand how this can still be the way in the modern 21st century.
Right.
Help us.
I'll try. So much of the roots of the problems in the Middle East today, you can really trace back to the peace that was imposed on the region at the end of World War I, specifically with the British and the French empires carving the region into imperial...
Just drawing lines on a map.
Just drawing lines on a map. I literally spent a weekend doing it. And what was not taken into account at all was this whole incredibly complex tapestry of tribes and clans throughout the entire region. So they created these artificial nations without any thought to how they would work together as a coherent unit. And it kind of held together for a long time, largely because you had these incredible autocratic rulers like Saddam Hussein in Iraq or the Assad dynasty in Syria. What happens when that falls apart, and the sense of national allegiance has always been skin deep to non-existent, people revert back to what was always their primary loyalty, which was to family, to clan.
Which predates more than just a century.
That goes
way back.
It goes thousands of years.
Although it's interesting, you point out that the six countries affected during the Arab Spring, so it's Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Tunisia, Yemen, most affected. They're all republics and not monarchies.
That's
Why is that significant to note?
I think it ties into the same idea of tribalism. What is a king or an emir after all? But it's there's a tribal compact to create a king or an emir. So I think in what you have in the monarchies throughout the Middle East is you have this tribal agreement that goes back centuries often. With republics, you didn't have that. And so what you also had when, I don't think it's all a coincidence, when you look at the 3 purely artificial states in the Middle East that were created by the British and the French at the end of World War I, it's Iraq, Syria, and Libya. And the very 3 countries that now have so disintegrated as to really raise a doubt whether they'll ever be put back together again.
You called them artificial.
Artificial states, yeah.
That's a good way to put it. One of the best-known public intellectuals in support of the Iraq invasion offered this observation. It was not written into the genes of the different peoples of Iraq and Syria that they would descend into anarchy because Britain and France had so botched the job of creating them in the first place. Politics in the shape of extreme dictatorships, which when they crumble give rise to hardened sectarians, layered onto decades of wars and revolutions, took the Arab peoples down today's ghastly road. That kind of politics was not always there. It came into being after the Great Arab Defeat of June 1967, with the rise of regimes that legitimized themselves on the basis of denial, rejection, and blame directed at everyone but themselves. Take any collective of millions of people ruled by the iron grip of that kind of politics, subject them for decades to grievous abuse in a concentration camp called a country. Surely, with Arab leaders like ours, it is not surprising that the hounds of hell will be unleashed. I'm inferring here, but I gather his point is more about decades of dictatorship rather than botched lines on a map from 100 years ago.
Right.
Agree or disagree?
One thing that always struck me about the Middle East was different in other places was people would always talk about what they were fighting against, rarely what they were fighting for. And if I went and talked to a Tamil tiger in Sri Lanka in the 1980s, it might be a really silly idea of what he was fighting for, but he could articulate what he was fighting for. In the Middle East, it's always been against. So and I've always felt that there's this culture of grievance that is very ingrained, and it's anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, anti-imperial, anti-West. So, I think this played a huge role in when the Arab Revolt started. And going to this idea that with the autocrats, what is going to take their place? There's no consensus on how to move forward. So things disintegrate. So
not going to be Jeffersonian democracy. We already know that.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
We are 50 years to the month removed from the Six-Day War.
Amazing. Yeah.
And I guess I want to understand better how you think that war reverberates in the so-called Arab Street 50 years later.
I think it goes to this very notion that goes to this culture of grievance, that we have been wrong, we've been historically wrong. And that can act as its own impediment. At a certain point, you have to get past history, and 50 years now is almost ancient history. But as long as you keep reverting back to the injustices that were perpetrated on you in the past, I think it's very hard to think about how to go in the future. And of course, the dictators in all these countries, they played on that. They loved having the Israel card because they could always play that to channel popular discontent away from their rule to this external enemy, and they could rally the people and say, we're going to go to war against the Zionists. Well, they didn't have to go to war against the Zionists. You just had to do the rallying cry.
All right, let me go back 40 years ago. It's actually 39 years ago. The Camp David Accords, which in the West, are obviously highly legitimate and highly praised. No doubt saved a lot of thousands of people from being killed in wars between Israel and Egypt, which didn't happen as a result of those accords led by President Jimmy Carter. Okay, again, help me with pronunciation here. Laila Souef?
Laila Souef.
Laila Souef, okay. Egyptian math professor, activist. She sees those accords as a betrayal and a national shame.
That's right.
Is that still the view, do you think?
Absolutely.
In the main?
Yeah. In the main, among the Egyptians. It's funny, I have never met, I'm sure they exist, but I have never met an Egyptian. And I've interviewed scores of Egyptians all the way across the political and religious spectrum. Anyone who looked at the Camp David Accords is anything but a national shame. That this made Egypt the lapdogs of the Americans, the servants of the Americans in the region, and there is this very deep sense in the Arab world of this kind of pan-Arab identity, this kind of a nationalist or a racial identity, and so it's not just dictatorship PR to say, oh, we care about what happens to Palestinians. They actually believe this very deeply. So for the Egyptians, they saw the Palestinians being sold down the river. And that was really the start. Of course, Anwar Sadat was assassinated for this very reason, because he was seen as selling out the Palestinians and becoming a lapdog of the Americans.
One of the main characters in your book is an Iraqi woman. Okay, here we go again. Yeah. Khulud al-Zaidi?
Khulud al-Zaidi.
Okay.
Yeah.
It is through her that you tell the story of the promise and the failure of the U.S. invasion in Iraq, which is going back now, 14 years
14 years,
now.
Yeah.
She welcomed the Americans into Iraq in 2003.
Right.
How come?
Khulud's an amazing story. She is from a provincial city in southern Iraq, from a conservative Shia family. Certainly the most future she ever saw for herself. She went to university, was to be an English teacher before she got married and started a family. So when the Americans came in, and all the Americans talk of women's empowerment, and that we're creating a new Iraq, and women are going to be equal to men in this new Iraq, it absolutely seduced Khulud. She started working with the Coalition Provisional Authority almost immediately, working on women's empowerment projects. Her mentor, this American woman named Fern Holland, was assassinated. She was the first foreigner to be murdered by the militants. And as the American power receded and authority receded in Iraq, Coolidge was kind of left stranded on the beach, so to speak. She continued to try to work on these women's empowerment projects to the point where the militias targeted her for assassination. And so her younger brother was murdered, probably because of what Coolidge was doing. She finally had to flee for her life.
She's gone now, right?
She's gone, and now she's in Austria. She spent 11, 12 years in Jordan in exile and is now in Austria.
And her German's pretty good now, I guess.
I guess it is, yeah.
What does she see as at the end of the day, the sort of cost-benefit analysis of that invasion now?
It's really poignant. I first met Coulomb when she was in her exile in Jordan, and she was just stranded, and she finally made the decision to join in the migrant exodus to Europe to have something change. But I remember having a long conversation with her in Amman, in Jordan, and she said, I and my sister we're just standing in place. We're living in limbo, and she said, I hate to blame my situation on anybody else, but I really wish the Americans had thought before they came into Iraq. That's what started all this.
This is admittedly a hypothetical question, so play with it as you will. Had the Iraq War not taken place, the American invasion of Iraq, would there have been an Arab Spring all those years later?
It's a great question. What the American invasion did was it scrambled, and not in a necessarily negative way. I mean, we all look at it now as this kind of catastrophe, which it was, but it didn't necessarily have to be. If the Americans had given more thought to what they were upsetting, Saddam Hussein had this incredibly elaborate system of alliances with tribes and clans. I mean, there's a very complex tapestry in Iraq, as there is in Syria, as in Libya, these other places. Americans were heedless to that, so they had no idea of what to replace it with. But on the potentially positive side, certainly getting rid of a guy like Saddam Hussein, who was a butcher and who had been in place for 3 decades. It initially sent a hopeful message through the region that these despots who had been there forever could actually be cast aside.
They're not bulletproof.
They're not bulletproof, and they can be cast aside. The Americans never figured out, or I don't even think it was on their radar, of how to capitalize on that. So would the Arab Spring revolts? I mean, I have to think that something would have happened. I've never been in a region more just fossilized politically as the Middle East was. And it has been that way for 50 years until the Arab Spring revolt started.
I think I've got this word right. The Americans' involvement in the Middle East you describe as inconstant? Is that the word?
Yes.
Meaning what?
Meaning that they really came in without any idea of what they were going to replace it with. And I think if you look at American foreign policy through the generations, there has always been this they've oscillated between engagement and then complete withdrawal. So they go in. Vietnam is a great example. They go in and it's like, oh, this is vital to our national security. This is the front line of anti-communism. Things don't work out. You jump out, and certainly that's what happened in Iraq. And by kind of packing up and leaving in Iraq, and that started under the Bush administration. It created the vacuum both for Iraq to politically fall apart, which it did, but also created the void, the military void for ISIS to rise.
Here's your quote. In my professional travels over the decades, I had found no other region to rival the Arab world in its utter stagnation. What explains that?
I think it goes back to this idea of this kind of culture of grievance and these dictators who had the ability to channel popular discontent, and frankly, some of the most elaborate secret police apparatuses in the world. One of the characters in my story, Majd Ibrahim, a young Syrian college student. I'd spent a lot of time with Majd and asked him all sorts of questions about his childhood and growing up, and his father was an engineer, so kind of upper middle class family. And I said, so what does your father think of the Assad regime? And Majd, who was 23, said, I don't know. I said, what do you mean you don't know? And he said, we never talked about it. And I found that astonishing.
And they never talked about it because?
They were afraid of the secret police. Like, if when Majd was a little kid, would he say something indiscreet to a neighbor? But it's so ingrained that, and he said, maybe the most you can do would be to talk about the corrupt traffic policeman down the street, who takes bribes. Above that, you would never criticize the regime in any way, even within the family. Astonishing.
Here's a quote from Majd. He says, "Blood brings blood. I don't think it'll end until everyone who has taken up a gun in this war is dead." Because of, I guess, the inevitability that revenge is required each successive generation.
That's right.
So this never ends, Scott. Is that the way we look at it?
Being a pessimist, you almost never go wrong.
When it relates to the Middle East, that's right. Yeah.
It's kind of an indication of the despair I feel of the region. When you look at a place like Syria, and I think it was actually something Majd said to me, that almost the only way you can see it ending is it's almost like a forest fire that burns itself out. That it reaches a point of just such utter ruin that there's no fuel left. And the one kind of parallel you might have for that in the region is Lebanon, the Lebanese civil war in the 1970s. At one time, Lebanon had almost 400 different private militias that people could count. So we're past that now with Syria, and then you also have the regional players. But how did the civil war in Lebanon ever end? And if you kind of go back and look at that, maybe there's a kind of a tortured roadmap there for Syria.
So that requires 40 years and millions more deaths.
I see no reason to be at all optimistic about Syria.
Here we go. Do you believe the foundations for a possible peace is ethnic and sectarian separation?
On one level, yes. I mean, my personal feelings of what has to happen in the Middle East is that power needs to devolve both to a more local level, to a clan, to a tribal level, and then on a larger kind of regional level, more kind of like the EU. I mean, how you get the Middle East to the EU, I can't tell you.
Well, it starts with presumably creating a whole bunch of more countries.
Yes.
Can you do that?
Or these kind of loose confederations. I mean, I think Iraq essentially now is very rapidly becoming a country in name only. It's really becoming three countries.
So a Kurdish country,
Shia country, and a Sunni country. The problem is that you can't draw these neat lines. You're going to have this wrenching process like you had with the de-Germanization policy at the end of World War II, or the partition of India and Pakistan in '48. But maybe that is all you can kind of do going forward. But it is going to be wrenching. And when people come up with that idea, let's just have little mini countries. For example, in Iraq, one of the biggest tribes in Iraq is half Sunni and half Shia. So what happens to them? Do they go by tribe? Do they go by religion? Because everything's gotten kind of diluted and mixed up now.
Let's finish up on this. When recently asked, in which country would you like to live? 18 to 24-year-olds from 16 Arab countries, they chose as follows: 35% United Arab Emirates, 15%, in spite of it all, the US, 14% Saudi Arabia, 14% Canada. What do you infer from those numbers?
Wow, it's fascinating. I think the draw of the UAE and Saudi Arabia is probably economic. One thing that clearly drives the fighting in most of these countries is massive unemployment and cronyism, so that it's in nepotism in jobs. It's certainly in government jobs. So it's very hard to advance at all on a personal level. So I think that's probably the appeal of UAE or Saudi Arabia. I don't think it's religion, and I would say probably the same for the United States and Canada. That it's largely drawn by it's largely a function of economic opportunity.
We should do this interview again in 30 years when the United Arab States of the Middle East has been created as the new Nirvana.
That's right.
And we can talk about how it all finally came to a peaceful end. Scott, it's good to see you. Thanks so much for coming in. Fractured Lands, How the Arab World Came Apart. Scott Anderson has been our guest. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.